Hello and welcome back to Freedom Families. Today we are going to talk about sex, and our guest is the lovely Rebecca Lindenbach. Rebecca is a young mom and a wife. She is also an author and a researcher. She partners with her mom and a friend. Is Joanna a friend, or how did you guys get connected?
We met through an international Bible quizzing competition. So like the most nerdy Christians you've ever met, that was us, because we were international level of Bible nerds.
Got it. So Rebecca does a lot of work with her mom, Sheila Gregoire, and a friend / Bible competitor. Today we're going to talk about sex in a way that is groundbreaking, in a way that's inspiring, in a way that whether you are in the church or not in the church, have probably not heard sex talked about before, and different aspects of sex. No matter who you are, you need to tune in today, because this is important and it is life-changing. It's life-changing. So let's start out just by, Rebecca, we're going to do 3 quick questions that we do at the start of every episode to remind our listeners that you and I are just regular people.
Yep.
Just like our listeners. So the first question is 3 people, dead or alive, that you'd like to have dinner with.
Ooh, Josephine Butler. She was awesome. Super cool. Everyone needs to look her up. William Wilberforce, also excellent person.
That's one of mine.
Yeah. And Rachel Den Hollander, who actually we chat because she endorsed our book, but I would just love, because she's a fellow homeschooling mom and she's in the same realm as us. Yeah, those are my people.
Were you homeschooled? Did your mom?
Yes, I was.
Okay, because she's been blogging for a really long time. Is that something, she was just doing the homeschooling thing and then kind of started to blog out of hobby? Is that how that started?
Yeah, my mom started her speaking and writing career when I was, I think even when we were still living in Toronto when I was in like 3 or 4, I think. Maybe it was a little bit older. Maybe I was 7, but she's been wanting to be a writer her whole life. Yeah, I know that she started researching and wanting to, and figuring out how to become an author, how to write, how to get your message out there when my sister was born. So that was like over 20 years ago.
She was writing about everything, family, marriage, right?
Yep.
But
she was really on the mommy blogger track, that kind of side of things.
And then she realized that whenever she wrote about sex, it gained a lot of traffic. And
I know, who would have thought it? People like to talk about sex. This is just groundbreaking. No one's ever discovered this before, right?
Yeah. Okay, so the second question then is one of the most impactful books you've ever read.
Oh, okay. That's a good one. I really liked... there's so many, I will say. This is a hard question. Oh my goodness. Okay. In terms of just generally made me think about life differently, I loved David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell, which is not a Christian book, I know, so maybe that's not a normal response.
Right.
And in terms of like faith books, for me, the book Your God is Too Safe, I believe, by Mark Buchanan. Is that?
It's back here somewhere.
Yeah. I loved that book. I read it in a major time when I was really struggling, and it just really helped me rediscover the love of Christ in a profound way.
Fantastic. The last question is, you, your husband, and your son, you have nothing to do the rest of this week, the rest of next week. You're going on a road trip. Where are you going to go?
Oh, this is going to be a sad answer because it's the year of COVID. We just go back to Ottawa and see all of our friends. We moved right during the first stay-at-home lockdown in Ontario, and so we weren't able to say bye to anyone. So we would go back and we would spend a week with our church family in Ottawa.
How far of a drive is that from
Only
where you
3
are?
hours, but in COVID, it's like a whole other country.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure we're in Minnesota, so we're not too far.
No.
People in Minnesota drive to Canada all the time.
Yep.
But I'm pretty sure the border's still closed. And you
guys are in the States, and it's way stricter up here.
Yeah.
For a lot of stuff. So.
All right. Well, let's get into the content. Yeah. I do want to mention to you guys that Rebecca wrote a book in 2018, I believe, called Why I Didn't Rebel.
Yeah, it was either 2017 or 2018.
Do you want to give us
one of those years?
just give us a 60-second synopsis, since that's not our focus today, but I still want to point our listeners to it.
Yeah, no, I wrote Why I Didn't Rebel because my mom was, again, blogging for a long time, and anytime she wrote anything about how teenagers don't have to rebel, she kept on getting the exact same comment. Well, nothing you can really do. You just kind of, they hit 13, then you cross your fingers and hope they come back around the dark side of the moon someday, right?
Yes.
And so mom had me write a blog post saying why I didn't rebel, because she was saying they can argue with me, but they can't argue with you, because you are living proof that, it actually worked. And that blog post went super viral. I got a book contract out of it. I wrote it. I did a big study of 25 other young adults. I did a giant qualitative analysis of my interviews and found out what themes were present among both families who did and didn't rebel and how they differed. And I put that together into a book, told lots of cool stories. And what I find so interesting about that book is that I had no idea that I was on the track to do research-based writing for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
I just did this book because it was a fun project and I was doing an honors thesis
You
at the
enjoyed
time.
it.
I loved it. And I was doing a qualitative thematic analysis honors thesis at the time in university. And so it fit perfectly. I had all the skills and I just did it. And so now we're still doing research-based books, but I'm not talking about parenting anymore. We're talking about sex.
So then after you finished that book, or was it during that book you started to kind of help your mom or at least be involved in what she was doing?
I wrote that book while I was in university. So I was a student while I wrote Why I Didn't Rebel.
Okay.
And then once I graduated, my mom hired me because she was looking for an assistant and I was looking for a web management kind of project manager position. And so she figured, hey,
worked out.
Who knows how to, in essence, the answer was, who knows how to ghostwrite like my mom better than the person who she taught how to write. So when I had to do social for a while, my job was just do her social media, and I did that. And now I don't really ghostwrite anymore. I more work behind the scenes.
Got it. So. And so let's start at the very beginning of. So as you mentioned already, your mom had been blogging for a long time. She had also been talking specifically about sex for a long time, even wrote courses and different things to help married couples have better sex.
Yeah.
But even though your mom had helped many, many people, she was still noticing that there must have been something else under the surface that was preventing married couples from having better sex.
Yeah, and we were struggling with this together because I helped with making a lot of those courses. I do all the research and scientific side of pretty much everything that we do because that's what I love to do. And we were creating all this great content. She was putting out blog posts for, at this point, like almost 10 years that we're talking about sex. And we keep on getting the same questions, right? Why can't I orgasm? Why does my husband still watch pornography? Why doesn't my wife want to have sex? Why does my wife want to have a lot of sex, but isn't willing to let me help her orgasm? Like, we're getting the same kinds of questions over and over and over again. Libido issues, pleasure issues, mutuality issues, consent and abuse issues. And we're just thinking, it can't be enough to give people good advice, because just good advice isn't working. Good advice is not undoing the harmful advice that they've been given before. And we knew there was something in the water and we didn't quite know what it was. And so my mom, bless her, decided in January of 2019 to read Love and Respect, the best-selling Christian marriage book out there that discusses sex.
Right.
Gary
and
Chapman's
she hadn't
5
read
Love
it
Languages.
Before, right? And
no, she hadn't read it
before. She didn't have any preconceived notions. She just kind of went into it like, let's see.
She actually did have some preconceived notions. She thought it was going to be a good book.
Oh, okay.
She had actually recommended this book before. She even quotes a small segment that she had read before out like in one of her books, because how many of us have done this, right? We see the big Christian complex says this is a good book, and we think, well, they love Jesus.
Yeah.
They're good people, so they must be right. They wouldn't be wrong about this, right? Like, there's no way everyone could be wrong about this.
Right.
And so my mom reads the chapter on sex in Love and Respect, and I wish that I still had the texts that she sent as she was reading it, because Joanna and we had this big group chat between the three of us. And she was just live texting like, oh my goodness, this is so much worse than I ever could have possibly imagined. And she, as she puts it, it was like a bomb went off in her living room because all of us who write together, we're all terrified of plagiarizing other people by accident. So we actually didn't read a lot of stuff in the field because we didn't want to accidentally steal anyone's ideas. Right? Because how many times we read something and then think, oh yeah, I thought of that later. And of course not. So because my mom is really trying to be as honest as possible, she actually didn't read like cover to cover all these books. She'd read excerpts every now and then. But, you know, when she actually sat down and read the chapter on sex, she realized not once in the entire chapter does Emerson Eggerichs mention that women can and should enjoy sex. The entire chapter is about how sex is a part of respecting your husband. It is non-negotiable. And if you don't do it, you are not meeting your husband's needs, and he will probably have an affair or watch pornography. The chapter is entirely a coercive threat to women. And that's our interpretation, of course. But when you read it, there's so much emphasis on how a husband needs this and how it is for men and not for women. In fact, there's this groundbreaking quote that my mom just texted us where she's like, I can't believe he actually said this. I can't believe he actually said this. And it was, if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have.
Let's quickly, because it keeps making me think of the purity culture, especially of the 90s and the early 2000s. So can you just talk about that for a second, how that is very closely linked to what even 10, 12-year-old girls are taught in some Christian circles?
Oh, well, I mean, it's what I was taught when I was 12, 13. I mean, I grew up in the middle of purity culture. My whole family, we were total I Kiss Dating Goodbye fans for years. And anyone who hears that is like, no, you weren't. No, yeah, we were. When I was 13 years old, she handed me I Kiss Dating Goodbye and said, this is a great book. Every teen should read this. By the time I was 16, we had all deconstructed as a family. But what I was told at 13, 14, 15, even as young as 12 and 11 is boys need you to help them stop.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, boys need sex. Boys want sex. Boys think about sex in a way that girls simply don't. And girls don't understand.
They can't stop. They have
I
no
mean,
control.
how many of us have been told in youth group that whole thing about how a boy will on average think about sex every 0.4 seconds or something?
Yes.
Right? And it's like, what? So what?
Right.
Why did we make
the next thing was the next part of that was to tell girls what they need to do because of that, not to talk to the boys about what they need to do.
Exactly. The next thing. So boys are thinking about sex every single second. And so you need to make sure they don't ever see your collarbone because then they might start thinking about sex every 0.2 seconds instead of every 0.4 seconds.
Right.
And so, and I am obviously being rather snarky with that. But as someone who is raised in the middle of this, it really can affect women. And you grow up hearing over and over and over again, sex is masculine. Sex is for men. Sex is something that women need to stop from happening. And then they need to control when it happens to make sure that their husbands don't have sex with someone else or don't turn to pornography. And by the way, that implies that if your husband does watch pornography or does have an affair, it is your fault because you just weren't sexy enough. You just didn't put out enough because this is something that was for him and you obviously didn't fill up his cup enough. And that was the message in Love and Respect. And my mom and I and Joanna all looked at this and we were just floored and we couldn't believe it. I mean, there was even the whole book, Love and Respect, is based on this idea that men need respect and women need love. And then they define respect as getting your way all of the time. And they would say that's not what they do. They would say that's not what they do. But when we read the book and when many others have read the book, that's the message we get. And what does that mean in sex? It means that she is completely erased because her needs, her experience, her pleasure don't even matter. In fact, this is just funny. We found this hilarious and we might just be a little bit immature because frankly, when you talk about sex all the time, you find a lot of things funny that other people are like, you're just weird. But we found this so funny. In Love and Respect, Emerson Eggers tells a story of a mom talking to her daughter about sex in marriage, you know, and her daughter was saying that, you know, he just wants it all the time and I don't want to have sex as much as he wants. And her mother says, Why would you deprive him of something that takes so little time and makes him so happy? And he has multiple O's on the so happy in the book. And we just killed ourselves. Because I was like, if that doesn't summarize it, what does? Like,
Right.
yeah, sex doesn't take that long. Well, of course not when you're not caring about what she's feeling. Yeah, you can
Mhm.
be a 2-minute Tommy if you don't care about her orgasm.
Mhm.
But like that's the whole mentality, right? Sex is something you do for him because it makes him happy, not because it's good for you, not because he cares about you, not because it's a way to show love. It's because you show love by giving him what he wants, not by meeting him on a spiritual and emotional and intimate level. And so when we saw this whole thing with love and respect, my mom posted about it, and we were swarmed with hundreds of comments from women who had been abused or whose abuse had been made worse or whose marriages became more dysfunctional after reading Love and Respect. And we were, frankly, it was a really hard week for all of us. And obviously, it was harder for the women who went through it, but being engulfed with hundreds of stories. And, you know, we hear a lot of bad stuff because of our job, but there was just so much of it.
Mm.
We got literally hundreds of comments. Joanna, our friend Joanna, she is an epidemiologist who's trained in biostatistics. She's a biostatistician. She's a very complicated title because she's incredibly smart. But she does a lot. She does all this, all of our statistical analyses, and she actually put together a report, a qualitative analysis, and then also showed that compared the different kinds of abuse and harm that were coming from Love and Respect using these hundreds upon hundreds of stories, compiled it into a really, really professional report, really easy to read, including the positive comments too, by the way. We didn't just
Okay.
include the negative. We did get some
And what at
positive
this point,
comments.
had you guys specifically asked for feedback, or was this just coming organically from your mother's post?
I mean, like we always ask for feedback on our posts. But I think that we asked people like, what has your experience been with Love and Respect? Like at the end of every single blog post, we're always like, what do you think about this? And
Okay,
people were just ready to talk.
got it.
Really, honestly, we couldn't hold it back if we tried.
What percentage of, the feedback did you get were women?
Most of it. Our
Okay.
blog also is primarily women who read. We did have a lot of men though comment that Love and Respect really backfired.
Mm,
And that they couldn't handle it when they read it because they just felt that it made them feel gross about themselves as a man
mm, okay.
because they were like, I'm not some animal who needs to be numbed,
Yeah,
by my wife sexually.
yeah.
And so we actually put together this report, and because Focus on the Family is like the main promoter of Love and Respect, we actually sent it to Focus on the Family with a cover letter explaining like, hey, we're assuming you just don't know. We didn't go to
Mhm.
them all fire and brimstone. We
Yeah.
went pretty nicely and we said, hey, just in case you're unaware, we just did this and we got this kind of feedback, and this is something we need to talk about. Um, and we honestly thought that they were going to listen,
Hmm.
and they didn't. They just said nothing. We didn't hear a single thing back.
And
Our
your mother
readers,
had been on their show, multiple
yeah,
times.
we have connections. She had the personal email of the people who she sent it to.
Mhm.
And our readers started emailing Focus on the Family, and they were getting responses from people saying, well, of course the book isn't meant for like abusive marriages. It's only meant for marriages that are going through hard times. It's a biblical message. We stand by it. And so then eventually we wrote to Focus again. A couple months later, we wrote to Focus again and said, hey, you haven't responded yet. This is what we are hearing that your people are responding to our readers. And let's just talk about it. Like, you can't say that this book isn't for bad marriages, because why else would you buy a marriage book? And also, the book itself says that it's good for marriages where, the husband is straying, where there's alcoholism, where there's pornography. Like, I don't really know what else that I don't really think that's just normal marriage issues if you have multiple affairs. And so we emailed Focus again. And again, we were kind of hoping that at least now that there'd been more buzz, maybe now we'd get a response. Still nothing. Still absolutely nothing. They didn't respond until we told them that we would go public with their lack of response, which is never, and I will say this was almost a year later from our first correspondence. It was like 10 months.
That doesn't sit well.
It's not good. And so then they finally did respond, a very curt email about how, this is simply a theological difference. We believe this is a biblically sound, empowering message for wives, like that whole thing. If anyone wants to see it, we do have the whole email correspondences, all of ours and all of theirs, linked on our blog. You can go look at it for yourself. But eventually, my mom, well, the whole team of us, the three of us, really put together an open letter to focus on the family and to anyone supporting Love and Respect, explaining exactly what they were supporting. And that has gone kind of viral multiple times. And frankly, after this whole debacle, Joanna and my mom were talking back in March of 2019. This is only a couple months later, when Focus on the Family had given us the cold shoulder, when we had these hundreds, and it was starting to become thousands of stories from people who had been harmed by Love and Respect. And Joanna said, I just wish there was some way that I could go back and get my PhD so that I could actually study this properly. And my mom said, we don't need a PhD for that. I'm sure we can get a book publisher to pay us to do it. Because that's how my mom thinks. And so we pitched it. We pitched the idea that we wanted to do a survey of evangelical women to find which evangelical teachings contribute to bad sex in marriages. We wanted to figure out which teachings are the ones that were causing those readers to come back to us again and again and again with the same issues, even after they were getting good messages. We wanted to figure out what exactly it was that was the poison in the water of evangelical marriage and sex teachings. And Baker Books signed on. And so now, a year and a bit after we signed the book contract, maybe it was less than that, maybe it was less than a year, we have a book published, The Great Sex Rescue. And it's been a ride. I will say that, we'll put it this way. Our survey, I was finalizing the questions for the survey within 48 hours of delivering my son. And we signed the final paperwork for the book while we have a picture of me postpartum lying in bed with all of my various cold packs and, everything, signing the paperwork for Baker.
That's excellent.
So, it's been a ride. It really has, but it's been amazing. And we got so much feedback, because Focus on the Family didn't listen to us when we had a few hundred women who had been abused. We got to survey 20,000 women to figure out what exactly was the rot in the water. And guess what? A lot of it's in Love and Respect.
What are some of the things that you found?
Yeah. Okay. So what we found was that there are core evangelical teachings that are present in a lot of our bestsellers, not just Love and Respect either, by the way, a lot of our bestsellers that lead to lower orgasm rates for women, lead to higher rates of sexual pain, and lower rates of feeling emotionally close during sex, lower ability to talk about difficult things with their husbands, all sorts of bad things. And the teachings that you hear, once you hear them, you're like, that actually makes sense. But none of us thought about it, right? So for instance, one of the worst ones that we found was that when women believe a wife is obligated to have sex with her husband when he wants it, everything is not great.
Including pain, right?
Including
we found
pain.
A correlation with pain for women.
That's actually one of the reasons we wanted to do such a big survey, was because women who experience sexual pain to the point that penetration is impossible is a very small percentage of the population, but they're a really important one. And we wanted to make sure that we had enough people that we could actually do some slicing and dicing with the data to figure out what exactly was causing those women to have a really rough time with sex. And just because no one ever talks about it, I do want to do a quick little thing. If anyone listening is experiencing painful sex, if sex hurts, if it hurts when you're being penetrated, that is called vaginismus. And it is not, it's common, but it's not normal. And there are treatments available for it, and it doesn't need to stay forever. I'll be very honest. I experienced vaginismus as a result of trauma due to my birth. And I don't mean just vaginal trauma. I mean psychological trauma. And, you can totally, there are so many treatments and there are so many ways to get through it. And I know how hard it is firsthand. But I'm hoping that with this book, if the trauma that has caused, someone to experience painful sex is because they've been told something about God, about their bodies, about their identity, about their marriage, that's not true, that means you can undo that.
Mhm.
You really can, work with a pelvic floor physiotherapist and, maybe work with a counselor to figure out where is your mind saying sex is a threat and you need to close off from it. So I just want to say that really quickly because we don't talk about sexual pain.
Right, let's also talk because, our name of this podcast is Freedom Families
Yeah.
because 'cause we're looking for freedom, which we
Mhm.
find in Christ and breaking free of chains, not freedom for licentiousness, but
Yep.
freedom for flourishing, and there are so many things that you guys have researched, that you put in the Great Sex Rescue, that you blog about, that talk about freedom in sex, and so let's talk about what is sex? Because I think it's so important. What do we mean when we say sex, or when a woman pictures what is sex? Let's even say, a couple in premarital counseling, when the fiance, the girl, is picturing sex and picturing what will it be like when we're married. What I think that's so important. So what is sex? What do people tend to think about that's incorrect? And then what actually do we know from the Word of God what sex should be?
Well, exactly. So here's the thing. Like you said, we're all picturing something really specific when we ask, when we say the word sex, right? You're probably picturing he penetrates her, moves around a bit until, he's done. And then they're
Mhm,
done. Then the sex is
mhm,
over, right?
mhm.
But the problem is that is actually only intercourse. That's not the full definition of sex, and here's why. When we talk about sex like it's only intercourse, her experience is completely secondary. They can have sex without even considering what she's going through. She can be checking off her grocery list in her head. She can be thinking about, oh, did I forget about Tommy's homework? She could even be in pain or being traumatized. And
Mhm.
it's still, oh, well, at least you're having sex. Right? So we
Right.
need to have a definition of sex that considers her experience too. So, what we want to suggest is that sex becomes redefined as, an intimate, personal, and emotional act that is done with the intention of bringing both of you to orgasm. Like, and I think that makes sense, doesn't it? That's why, we call oral sex, right? It's
Mhm.
these kinds of ideas about sex where it's just about intercourse and having intercourse enough times a week to keep each other, topped up.
Yeah.
We found in our survey that only about 48% of women orgasm almost always or always, whereas about 95% of men do, according to multiple studies.
A huge
And
gap
so,
that
a
we're told
huge
is
gap.
just normal, and that's the way it is.
But here's part of the reason why I think we have that gap. Our survey was incredibly invasive, by the way. Just as you will probably realize, the more I talk about our survey, I am so grateful for all the women who gave us,
I took it.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Yay. Yeah, so exactly how invasive and personal it
Mhm.
was. So we didn't just ask women, how often do you orgasm? We also asked them, how are you able to orgasm? And what we found is that among women who are able to orgasm, and that's not even just who are consistently orgasming, just who women who can ever orgasm, only 30% are able to orgasm through intercourse alone. So that's not 30% of all women. That's just 30% of women who even can orgasm. Right? And so when we reduce sex to intercourse, when we know that 70% of women who are orgasming are not doing it through intercourse alone, we are saying that it's okay to have sex where the majority of women are going to feel nothing when it comes to sexual pleasure.
Let's talk to that, couple who are engaged again, and
Yeah.
what does that mean exactly? If you're
Yeah.
talking to that girl who is engaged, and you're saying that it's gonna take more than just penetration for her to orgasm, what does that mean?
Yeah. And I think what we need to talk about, and this is what we've been very loath to talk about in the church, because we don't actually like to get nitty gritty, because then what if people get ideas in their head and they actually start doing it?
Yeah.
Right. And I'm like,
Mhm.
okay, like, Have you talked to many dating or engaged couples? When people say that, I'm like, you know what? I know a lot of people who were just told nothing but don't have sex until you're married. And you know what? They don't have sex until they're married in terms of intercourse, but they are doing other things already. And so what if we give people a more holistic understanding of, hey, sex is about more than just don't put the P in the V.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about recognizing, that any act that is bringing, you closer to orgasm as the goal
Yeah.
really counts under sex. I think that when we talk about sex with premarital couples, I don't see why we shouldn't be explaining to them all the different ways to bring each other to orgasm. Why not talk about what manual stimulation means, what oral sex means? Talk about, you give them, you don't need to, like as the, older couple who's doing the mentoring, don't need to give them the information yourself. But what about offering them, the information through another educational way? Like maybe there's a book out there that has information about how to bring each other to orgasm. Recommend the course that we have on our website for engaged couples, the honeymoon course. We talk about a lot of stuff in there pretty explicitly. But when we tell couples don't have sex until the wedding night, what I wish we would tell them is, maybe don't have sex until you're married and your bodies are like screaming for it. Right? Because what we found in our survey and in doing focus groups with women is a lot of women, especially, they get married and they were the quote unquote, they did everything right? They were raised in the purity culture mindset of just don't have sex, and they did nothing more than kiss or make out until they were married. And then their wedding night comes and they're like petrified because they've been so excited for this, but they're like, I don't know what I'm doing. And then they have sex and it's just awkward and it doesn't feel good. And sometimes it even hurts. And they're like, what on earth did I just do?
And then that can lead to other problems early in marriage.
Totally. I mean, think about the resentment, the anger, the awkwardness,
Guilt,
the
shame.
guilt. Oh my goodness,
Mhm.
those ones are so big,
Mhm.
And so if we told those couples, maybe don't start on hard mode. If we know that only 30% of women who like have physical, get to orgasm, do it through intercourse alone, why not just encourage couples to be like, just be naked together and then just touch each other and
Yeah.
then maybe explore other ways of touching each other.
Mhm.
And eventually when you feel like you've in essence like kind of graduated from the easy versions of helping women orgasm, then yeah, have all like try it the other ways too. But I think that we talk so much about marriage being like the finish line when it comes
Yes.
to waiting, and it's
Yes.
not the finish line. It's the
Mhm.
starting point of learning this person who you're going to have the pleasure of pleasuring for the rest of your life.
That's so great. Let's expand on that because I think even in culture, in Christian and secular culture,
Mm-hmm.
both, whether it's through entertainment, through parents and friends, just the way that people talk about sex, especially with the amount of affairs and things that happen or divorces that happen as people age, the kind of the way we talk about it is the wedding night is the best sex you're ever gonna have, and the longer you go in marriage with the same person, the worse that it's gonna get, the more boring
Yeah.
it's gonna get, right? And that's why people have affairs because they get bored of having sex with the same person. So that tends not to be the case, and that's also not what God's design is or plan is. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, and I think there was one study that I just read last week, and I wish I could remember who the researchers were, but they all have very long last names. But there's a study that showed that we've all seen this before, where like this is kind of like what you're talking about, where there's this graph where like you're dating and your happiness goes up and up and up, and then you have
Mhm.
like maybe you get married and you have kids and it's like, oh, it goes down in the pits, and then maybe it slowly comes back up after you're an empty nester again, but really it's never going to
Yes.
get back to the beginning.
Yeah.
That is not the case for good marriages. There's been a new study that comes out that marriages that don't like that just kind of stay healthy, it's just kind of good.
Mhm.
Like there might be individual ups and downs along the way, but the general plot of the marriage is you're just kind of always satisfied. Even because if you're in a good marriage going through a hard time, you can often look at it and be like, but we're good people. We're just going through something versus like, I actively hate my spouse.
Right. And
And
if we think of sex as something that you do to know one another, right? If we're
yes,
using biblical language, they didn't say had sex, right? Adam knew his wife.
Mhm.
It's about being mutually pleasurable, mutually intimate. Then sex is actually something that you are doing together, and it brings you
Yes.
closer. One flesh, right? I mean, one
Well,
flesh. You're not one flesh if all you're doing is having intercourse and the husband is ejaculating, the woman's thinking about her grocery list, right? That's not knowing one another. That's not being becoming one flesh. It's
and it
something that
doesn't sound
you're
that hot either, I'm gonna be
no,
honest.
you're building it together. And as you
Well,
get to know each other better, you will get better at being able to pleasure the other, and you know their body and the way that they work and the way that they move, and you know how their day's been, you know all those things. It's
well,
something that you do together. And I can't remember the study either, but I know that there was a study recently that found that I think it was Christian women in their 50s who had only ever been married to the same person were the most satisfied sexually out of all of the demographics that they
yeah,
were.
and I know that my mom did a survey, like non-scientific, just a fun one, for her book, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, back in 2011, and she found that, yeah, I think it was after year 14 or something of marriage is generally when sex is the best. And I think that what you were saying about how it's not just in the church is so important, because what you're talking about is the difference between an intimacy view of sex versus a pornographic view of sex.
Mm,
Is sex hot because it's new and exciting? Or is sex hot because of your love for the other person?
mhm,
You know, what's the aphrodisiac? Is it seeing something new? Is it new sensations? Is it more extreme? Is it the danger? You know, or is the aphrodisiac the intimacy and the connection? Because when we see sex as an intimate knowing, it actually just gets deeper and better as you age. As I mean, as someone who now has kids, right, with my husband, I mean, like, it just bonds you in this whole new way the more you do life together, like every little thing that happens, like when we got married, we were two kids who were just really in love and really happy. We were so excited
yeah,
about the potentials of the future. But then
mhm,
with everything that happens, he's now the man who walked me through my honors thesis. He was there when I found out that my honors thesis paper had been peer reviewed published. He was there when I found out for the first time that I was pregnant. He
yeah,
was
yeah,
there when, I dealt with a lot, when I dealt with my anxiety issues when I was in university. He was there through it all. And so it's not new when you're married to someone who you love. It's
mm,
not. And sometimes there are new things that you can do and spice things up, but overall you're not getting that, you know, that that the next high that you often need when you're
this is
watching
it.
pornography
As
or
you're going
something like
through that,
that.
it makes me think of materialism, right? We're told the
Yeah,
newer, the better, the bigger of everything, whether it's a cell phone or a
exactly.
house or a car or sex.
Yeah, except what happens when you have that mindset is you never get to actually enjoy what you have, right?
You're
I mean,
never
how many of
satisfied,
us
right? Content.
exactly. I mean, it's the difference between, I mean, this is not a perfect metaphor, of course, but it's the difference between leaving, when you're used to only renting an apartment for every 6 months versus your childhood home that you were born in
Mm,
and then you like bought from your parents and then you've now
yes.
lived in and raised your kids in, and then
Uh-huh.
like you're finally like 70 and you're passing it on to
Yes.
your kids. Like
Yes,
that's
I
the
love that.
difference,
I love
right?
it.
And I think
Mhm.
that when we understand that sex biblically is not about a quota. It's not about getting as much as you can and getting it whenever you want. That's not what sex is. And we know that for multiple reasons when we look at the Bible. Okay, first of all, like you said, God uses the word know when he talks about sex in Genesis 4. He says, Adam knew his wife Eve and conceived unto her a son, right? And that's
Mhm.
the same word that he uses when in the Psalms, that David uses in the Psalms. He says, search me and know me, O God. It's a penetrative act of just
Mhm.
fully immersing yourself in another person, right? You want to be fully saturated. That's what that is. Search me and know me. It's not just about know the facts. It's about know
Mhm.
me. And that's the beginning example of sex. And they do have other words for sex they use throughout the Bible. There's ones where it literally just means the coitus. Um,
Right. Yep.
they have those
Mhm.
words as well, but that's what God chose to use when he introduced sex in the Bible. And then later on, we see in Song of Solomon, both the young man and the young woman are incredibly randy for one another.
Yeah.
Okay, they are
Not
they are
one-sided.
both
Mhm.
looking forward to meeting under that tree. Okay.
Yes.
This is very much a mutual experience in
Mhm.
terms of desire. They are both going to get immense pleasure under that tree. Um, so this is not something that is for men in the Bible. The Bible very clearly states that women have sexuality. In fact, women are the ones who are warned, do not awaken love before its appointed time. Um, because, women are sexual beings as well. That's what we see in scripture. But then furthermore, in 1 Corinthians 7, we know that sex was meant to be fully mutual and was meant to be something that um, both of you are a part of. So both of you should know one another. Both of you should enjoy sex, but also both of you matter. Because the verses that are often used against women so often in 1 Corinthians 7, a husband does not have authority over his body, but also yields it unto his wife. Likewise, the wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it unto her husband.
Right.
Um, those verses have been used so often against women.
Mhm.
But in the culture that they were spoken, that was so freeing for women. Because
Mm.
in that culture, women were the property of their men. So he starts it by saying, husbands, you don't own your bodies. Your wives get a say over what you do. And that was in a culture where a husband was allowed to do anything he wanted to his wife. And there wouldn't really be any ramifications legally because she was his property.
Right.
And so for Paul to come in and say, your bodies are not your own, and that includes men, that is groundbreaking. That is not a threat to women. That's giving women their autonomy back. That's giving women the ability to say, hey, you don't get to sleep with other people, or hey, you don't get to deprive me, but also, hey, you don't get to just do whatever you want and not consider me because I have a say. Paul was giving women a voice, and so often those verses have been used to take women's voice away when it comes to sex. And I find that to be a huge travesty, because when you look at the larger picture of scripture, when you look at the context in which scripture was written, it is so clear to me that God sees sex as something that is supposed to be humanizing, dignifying, and respectful of both parties. And
Yes.
it's so sad that we've missed that. And I think if we get back to a true biblical ethic of sex, not just a one verse taken out of context ethic of sexuality, when we look at the Bible and look at sexuality through the lens of the cross and who Jesus is and who we are called to be, I just don't see how you can get to if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have, and you have to give it to him because otherwise he's not going to feel respected.
I really see a parallel between the way that the church has either not talked about sex at all,
Mm-hmm.
in the way of, you're fine, it's just the only rule is don't have sex until you're married, and that's all we're gonna talk about it. I mean, for me, I didn't hear about sex in the church at all. My particular church, we didn't cover it at all, and even in premarital counseling, wasn't mentioned. And so I see this parallel between, because correct me if I'm wrong, the pervasiveness of pornography use outside and inside the church doesn't vary very much.
Yeah, I think from what I've seen, it varies more based on location. I have seen some studies that have suggested that the Bible Belt is actually worse than other areas.
So that's exactly kind of what I'm playing at here, is that if we're telling girls and boys, but specifically to the boys, that you have a need that needs to be fulfilled, you're going to think about
Mhm.
sex all the time, you have a physical desire that needs to be met, the cup needs to be filled this often, right?
Yep.
If that is what you are telling, you have a son, I have 3 sons, if that's how you teach them about sex, they're going to think that what you say is true. And what you're
Well,
saying to them is you have a need that needs to be fulfilled, and you can't have sex until you're married. So what do? And
yeah.
so often that turns into pornography,
Well,
whether
what also
it's
happens that I've seen, which is even, I think is just so this is ridiculous and just hurts my brain to think about, is how many times in youth group are we told things like boys are all struggle with pornography. So, and they're trying to make it not a shaming message, right? They're trying to help boys understand that if you struggle with porn, you're not a freak, we're here for you. But what they don't say, some people struggle with porn, that what they say is, boys all struggle with pornography. Every single
Yes.
man struggles
And
with
lust,
sexual temptation and
right,
lust. Yeah,
lust.
all forms
Mhm.
of sexual temptation. And do you know, I've actually met multiple men who started their pornography addiction because they were worried that they weren't manly enough after listening to what their youth pastor said about porn, because they weren't tempted by porn.
Yeah.
They were kind of like gross. I was like, I don't really know. Like, I don't really want to get into that. That seems a little weird. And then they're like, maybe I'm not a man.
Maybe I'm weird because I'm not into the pornography.
Exactly. And I'm just like, it just hurts my brain. And I'm like, why? Why did we make this sound like this was more powerful than Jesus? You know, because that's
Mhm.
how we've talked about it. We've talked about it like it's a bigger threat than what the cross is able to carry. And when we talk about pornography in that way, we can inadvertently tell boys, this is your birthright, you know? And then
Yeah.
by doing that, we simultaneously shame the many, many young girls and women who struggle with pornography addiction, because not only do they feel shame because of their addiction issues or because of their bad habit with pornography, we also shame them because you shouldn't be struggling with this because you're a girl. You
Mhm.
shouldn't be dealing with this because you're a girl. This is gross for you to be dealing with because this is a man's issue,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
what we're just hoping is that we're able to stop in the church seeing sexuality through a pornographic lens. Because when we talk about porn, like every single man is always going to be tempted by it. And so you must have sex with your wife so that you don't watch porn.
Yes.
We're actually comparing sex with your wife to pornography. And we're saying that sex with your wife will cure you of your pornography when it won't. If flat out, it will not. That does not work. Multiple people have found that. It's not just us. Because the lure of pornography is, like I said earlier, it's the new high. It gets more and more intense. It gets more and more raunchy. You can always find something more depraved.
Mhm.
And so that dopamine receptors in your brain, they need more and more and more, the same way that, this is why people overdose on drugs, right? Because their dependence,
Yeah.
like they need more and more to get the same level of high. And we found similar things happen in the brain when it comes to pornography. So when we tell women, you need to stand in the place of pornography, we are asking them to fill a role that God never intended for them and did not design for them and did not design for their marriages. And when we say that, we cheapen sex, we disrespect both men and women. And also, we are missing the larger conversation around pornography and sex, which that issue with pornography is not just that men are getting their rocks off in the wrong place, it's that they are victimizing others. And that pornography is an evil that is beyond simply sexual purity of the individual watching, but is also
Yes.
fueling sex trafficking, including
Yes.
trafficking of children. Even if you don't watch child porn, you're still
Mhm.
fueling child sex trafficking.
And
And
fully, I mean, one of the words of the year is dehumanizing, right? There's
yep.
nothing more dehumanizing than pornography.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think what my husband did a big blog post series for my mom a while ago. Did all the research on what people need to know about pornography and sex trafficking. And the thing that shook him to his core the most, the thing that really just hit him, and it took him a long time to recover from writing those posts. I will be honest, because he really had to read a lot of horrible stuff. And
Mhm.
one of the things that really hit him was he learned that child sex traffickers will use what people watch of adults having sex and will use that to inform what they should do next. So even if you're watching pornography that is ethically made, quote unquote, that is of consenting adults,
Yeah.
you're still fueling the research of child sex traffickers. And, odds are, some they're going to make someone else do that. And it's just horrible. And this is what we need
Yeah.
to talk about, because all we've talked about in the church is, well, it's just bad for men to watch porn because it's a sin.
Mhm.
They're not pure anymore in that way. Right. And
Mhm.
if we talk about pornography more realistically, where it's like, you know what? This is something that a lot of people really do struggle with. The internet is out there. We can't protect people 100% from seeing things they don't want to see. Some people are just going to get swept up into it. They're going to know it's wrong. They're going to do it anyway. But if we focus on it from a perspective of what is just, what is good, and how
Mm.
do we love our neighbors versus how do we make sure we ourselves are pure, I think we'll end up with a much healthier understanding of sexuality, and we'll still end up with people trying to act right. But much of our emphasis has been about, how do I control myself? How do I control this, control that? And if we
Mhm.
focus more on how do I allow the Spirit to open my eyes to see the people in front of me as, sons and daughters of Christ, I think that is the paradigm shift we need when it comes to sex.
Absolutely. It's the difference between depending on self-control, which will almost always fail at some point,
Yeah.
right? It's the difference between self-control and the cross.
Yep.
And, as you think about your son growing up,
Uh-huh.
how are you going to talk about sex to him in a way that is healthy and open? Yeah, what are some of the things you and your husband have talked about in how you can raise your son and future sons and daughters in a healthy view of sex?
Oh, we've talked about this a lot. Yes.
That's good. I
Yeah.
think most parents don't talk about that. It's like,
Yeah.
they just don't talk about it at all. Maybe it's awkward, maybe just ill-equipped.
Yeah, I think a lot of parents are just really ill-equipped, and it's not their fault. They haven't been given the good equipment.
Mhm.
They haven't been given the education that parents need, right? One thing that we really feel quite passionate about, which might sound weird, but we're not gonna talk about sex in a gendered way because I
Okay.
don't think it helps. It doesn't
Okay.
help to say boys are visually stimulated because
Mm.
there are girls who are visually stimulated too.
Mhm.
What if we just say instead, you're probably going to see people you find really attractive, and it's going to be very tempting to think about them in very disrespectful ways. It's
Yeah.
going to be very tempting to think about them in disrespectful ways sometimes. And, your job is to remind yourself of their humanity, tell yourself, not for me, and move on.
Mhm.
The focus so much that we've told teenagers has been make sure you dress modestly, make sure you don't hang out with people who are bad influences, make sure that you bounce your eyes if you ever see anyone you find pretty. And
Yeah.
what I'm hoping we can instill in our son and in our kids is that sexuality is not about making sure you don't do something. It's about choosing what you do.
Hmm.
And when you're not married, what you choose to do is affirm the humanity and dignity of the people around you. And that doesn't include lusting after them. That doesn't include using them for your sexual gratification. And that doesn't include pushing them past their boundaries ever in any way. And, we're going to talk about how we do think sex should remain in marriage.
Yeah.
But
And we
so much of our conversation has been about what not to do. And I want to raise my kids to learn your sexuality, whether you are married or not, is about affirming the humanity and dignity of those around you. And that includes your spouse when you're married, by the way. Um, and so I think that if we just talk about sex with that very subtle change, I hope that it makes a difference in the next generation. And we'll figure out the specifics. My son's only 18 months old. We'll figure out
Mhm.
the specifics as we go along. But I think that's the place to start because what we are missing in the Christian conversation is consent. First of all, we didn't find a single book that had a robust understanding of consent other than our secular control book, John Gottman, his 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work book. Um, as well, just the idea that sexuality is not about a red light, green light situation. It's always about taking it past the rules and looking at people as image bearers of Christ and asking yourselves, how do I best respect and honor the fellow image bearer in front of me?
Mm.
Because when you're married, that might include incredibly hot sex, you know?
Yeah.
But when you're not, it doesn't include picturing the woman at the beach naked. So,
Mhm. Right. Yeah, I think it can make a huge difference just the way that we're talking about sex. And it can be what you and I have talked about today, it can be extremely empowering. It
mhm.
it can be so beautiful and wonderful and talking about thinking of people as a whole human being,
Yeah.
not just as a physical commodity, something to use to pleasure yourself. And I think that's something that both the Christian circles and secular circles are missing today.
Yes.
And I think what you guys are doing with your blogs, with your book, and you're going on for more research
Yeah.
and you guys are working hard to keep going with this. That can be freeing and empowering to people both in and outside of the church. And hopefully, even as people outside of the church listen to this, they can be pulled in and realize that there is freedom both for their married sex life and with Christ.
Yeah, I just really hope it's just like that. It's a message of freedom. I know so many women, especially, have felt so much shame and guilt about sex. Maybe they didn't quote unquote do everything right, and maybe they got messages about how if you kiss a boy or if you make out or if you have sex before you're married, you're a crumple up piece of tissue paper or you're a
Yeah.
half-eaten chocolate bar, or maybe then they got married and their marriage they were surprised with a pornography addiction and they just feel like, am I not good enough? Or
Yes.
maybe they get married and sex isn't as easy as they hoped it would be and they just feel like, am I broken? And what we're hoping that our book and our research can just show is that no, you're not broken, you are enough, and that there's no need for any condemnation because Jesus loves you, and you have value beyond your hymen.
Right.
And and that sounds silly, but how many of us have not been taught that? How many of us need to be told you have value beyond compare, regardless of what you've done with your body, regardless of what's been done to you, whether it was with your consent or not. You have value. You are not used up. You are not broken. You were created to be loved and you were created to be cherished. And if you're not being loved and cherished in a way that, God wants for you, that's not your fault. And that's something that you can fix. And that's something that we hope we can empower women and men alike to have just the knowledge and the ability to transform their marriage if it needs it so that it can look more and more like Christ.
Speaking of men, I had my husband, you guys sent out a husband survey too. What's the plan with that?
We did. Yeah. So we did, my mom and dad actually wrote together the Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, which is coming out. I should know the date, but I don't.
Okay.
It's coming out sometime, I think, next year. But also, we're hoping to use the men's results from our survey, which are really interesting, by the way, to talk more about the lust issue and marital satisfaction in general when it comes to sex from a male point of view as well. Because I will say one of the really great things we found on the survey, which is what we expected to find, is that men really want their wives to enjoy sex. Like, it's like no brainer again, right? Like men are not horrible people for the, for the most part, and so what I'm hoping we can, this is why the Great Sex Rescue is not only for women too, right? Like this is a couples book. This could be read by just a man, just a woman, couple together, be read as a book study group if you're really open and honest with each other. You can, we've had quite a few people give it to their older teenage or like young adult kids who are single because they knew they grew up with purity culture messages. And because we know that when we have one part of the team, when one person on the team is struggling, the whole team suffers, right? And so far, when it comes to sex, women have been the ones who have been struggling. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, they've been left in the dust. It's not their fault. They've been given the wrong information. They've been given toxic messages. They've been told over and over again in a million different ways, you don't matter as much as your husband does. And if husbands and wives and churches want to see marriages thrive, if we want to see families, truly find freedom in many different ways, we need to start listening to women's voices and we need to start telling women, you matter too. You both matter. And that's what the Great Sex Rescue does.
I think the work that you guys are doing is some of the most important work out there. I really do. So thank you so much for coming on. And I would love to check back with you in maybe a couple months, maybe sometime this summer and see where you guys are at. Just before we go, point our listeners and to all the places to find you, to find your mom, to find the work that you guys are doing.
Of course, it's lucky that we just totally work together, so it's super easy. Just go to lovehonorandvacuum.com. You'll find our Bare Marriage podcast. You'll find all the latest blog posts. You'll find all of our courses and links to all of the different books. But to lovehonorandvacuum.com, that's really the place to go.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And have a great rest of your week and weekend.
You too.